And I talked about this in conference about the ghost in a cockpit. And we, not just me, but a lot of human factors people, and a lot of us were very young in our career, and established human factors experts were pulling together this data and saying, look, people are discussing this in forums. This is a serious safety problem. So together, we brought this up to manufacturers, pointing out. And so we were distilling where the problems are before accidents have happened, and accidents have happened because of these problems as well. But we had a backup data of incidents that pilots reported it in forums. So I saw the similarity of what was happening 20 years ago. And I, reached out to Ryan and said, like, look, Ryan, we had this problem before. Let's tackle it in the same way. Let's not wait. Let's see how we can use that culture change of reporting, because then it became not a blame culture. So there was a culture shift change where there was not blaming anymore the pilots, but they had a reporting system where the errors and problems were reported as incidences that they could then be stacked up and start to looked at. So that's how I got into UAP, and feeling that we can build it up from safety point of view, just like Ryan entered in the same way. But I always support the pilots. I'm not leading. I'm just looking at their reports. So I thought we cannot discount the ghost in the cockpit or out of the cockpit.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. So today we have the unique field of space psychology to look into. So we're going to be discussing the psychology of military pilots and astronauts working under these extreme conditions, and the intuitive skill sets developed under such high-pressure split-second decision situations. We're also going to discuss the cognitive engineering required to match the design of instruments to the cognitive needs of the pilots and the astronauts, which turns out not to be quite as easy as it might seem. It's more difficult because it's not obvious how to communicate and share such intuitive expertise and skills in words. So we're also going to get into some alternative methods of expertise exchange apart from the usual textbook approach, which have had extraordinary decision-making results, both for pilots and astronauts. We're going to be discussing also the issues for pilots around the reporting of UFO encounters and the implications for space psychology of this new bout of mainstream interest following the New York Times 2017 expose of military incidents confirmed by Senator Harry Reid. So who better to help us understand the minds of pilots and astronauts than space psychologist, cognitive engineer, astronaut instructor, and director of the Center for Space Medicine at UCL in London, Dr. Whiteley. Now, she's helped design training programs and conducted studies for the European Space Agency. She's trained at the Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center in Russia. Now, Dr. Whiteley is also a pilot, a rescue scuba diver, and a competitive skydiver, just pursuing her interest in these, in the direct experience of these extreme environments. She's written 11 scientific papers and 3 books: Toolkit for a Space Psychologist to support astronauts on exploration missions to the Moon and Mars, Earth Designs for Toddlers, and her new book to be published shortly, which we'll be getting into at the end. Now, please, listeners, give me a hand if you like these interviews by hitting subscribe or sharing wherever you're listening. Give us a 5-star review or a comment just to help stroke those algorithms. It really helps. And keep writing to me with your personal reflections about the shows and your guest suggestions. That contact with you, listeners, just makes it all worthwhile. So I have been fascinated by Dr. Whiteley's impressive work ever since she was recommended by my previous guest, religious studies professor Diane Pasulka. So I just can't wait to get into this. So without further ado, let's go. So Dr. Whiteley, welcome to Chasing Consciousness. Thanks for coming on the show. How are you this morning?
Beautiful. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to conversing with you and diving into topics.
Absolutely. We've got a lot to get through. So before we get into space psychology and your new book, all about children, there's a whole bunch of context from your really fascinating career that we just need as a foundation to sort of understand properly the full implications for space psychology. So listeners, thanks for bearing with us as we do this, because Dr. Whiteley's expertise, research, and insights is really, really broad. So it's just going to take us a little while to unpack. So let's start with your first specialization, cognitive engineering, which you qualified in at Bath University. This is a field that many of us won't have heard of. I certainly hadn't, which connects the engineers designing interfaces for operating machinery with the information flow needed by the operators themselves. In your case, cockpit design. Can you start telling us about this unique field and how important it is for those companies to have a cognitive scientist to sort of bridge the gap between engineers and final users?
Yes, I came to it also anew. So the professions arise as we grow and universities catch up in a way. I came from clinical psychology and research and already working in aviation as as an aviation psychologist in doing selection. And I was interested in how pilots think. And just at that time, there was a conversion of cockpits coming in, meaning we went from analog, which is a dial, to a screen, to a computer screen. And I was fascinated, with that change. So I was flying with Emirates. I was sitting in the cockpit. We were flying to many countries, and I could see those incredible, latest aircraft coming in. And so I was asking pilots, what was happening. And in the background, there was this discussion about a ghost in a cockpit. And I was like, what do you mean? And it was more of a description of something they don't understand. So I thought, okay, I asked my clinical psychology supervisor, I was like, how can I get into this field? And he said, well, why don't you just read journals, scientific journals that are peer reviewed, find people who ask questions that you are interested in, and then get in touch with them, and see if you can progress from there. And I was just, this is exactly what I want to do. And I found someone called Gavin Linton, Dr. Gavin Linton, and he was, at the time, it was called human computer interaction before it got named to cognitive engineer. And so he has a psychology research background, and he was looking how people, what are the problems in our understanding of information. So that's how human computer interaction and interface came in. And he was looking at how to present information in such a way in this new designs of aircraft. And he was working for Australian Ministry of Defense, where they will be studying human factors, so effect of a human in a system. It could be a large system or an aircraft in this case. And I got in touch and I said, well, what can I do? How can I contribute? What kind of research questions do you have? And he said, well, at the moment, and this is when the bazinga, like a light came up, because what I saw flying with Emirates pilots at the time, absolutely new to the aircraft, and telling me these stories in the background, just because we were flying a lot around, selecting cabin crew. And they said, and what Gavin said, that they look for information instead of information being right there when they need it. They will go through pages of electronic data. They will take a few minutes to set up. Well, not few minutes, sometimes half an hour to put in all the navigation points, how they will fly. And I said, okay, I'd like to study. So Gavin invited me on a scholarship in Melbourne. And I started studying on what pilots do. And I walked in our first conversation with pilots, and I had no clue what they talked about. And I thought, right, I need a pilot license. So Melbourne Airport is the best place to go. And so it's not a commercial, such as a large airport where the aircraft fly, but there was a smaller airport. And as soon as I started feeling and understanding what are they encapsulating as they move through the flight, and it's dynamic, you have to adapt. And I understood what situational awareness means, meaning being ahead of the aircraft. And so all of that is collating continuously evolving timeline, continuously evolving information flow, continuously evolving inputs from air traffic control, cockpit, things that are not available. You either have to remember or search, coordination of the crew, all your previous understanding on how to fly conventional aircraft versus modern glass cockpit. And and suddenly, because I spoke the language and I got the concepts, they opened up and I started speaking. And for me, it was a revelation. What was the obstacle for initially, okay, I don't fly airplanes. I mean, I understand the basics of what it might be, but actually having an experience somehow made people connect. And so that's how I end up being in cognitive engineering, which is the evolution of the name came because I trying to construct of what engineers want to, not trying, but I'm listening carefully and being a go-between of what the engineers think they can put onto the cockpit. And initial designs were driven by what engineers thought they could put into the cockpit. But a lot of it was what pilots is distracting or unnecessary to be on the primary flight, but also additional displays. And then by talking to pilots on what they're actually using and having experience myself, I also trained on Airbus 320 and 777 in the not flight simulator, meaning flying as a pilot, commercial pilot, but to study how the pilot, let's say even a private pilot license, will convert to a glass cockpit. So it's called ab initio training, where you do computer-based training and then you go into simulator, into real flight, and so on. Mm-hmm. So I've picked that up so I could understand the modes, I could understand what they're taught, and then speaking to engineers, I understood the other side. Mm-hmm. And that's where the merge was happening, is how do you connect the two? How do you get the timing right? And a lot of engineers, not necessarily pilots. So, and that link is tricky to make. Engineers know what to do, what capabilities they are, and pilots get involved too late. And then the engineering or design team doesn't want to change it because it's a lot of financial implications, timelines, and as we know. Yes.
Well, becoming a pilot on purpose really is representative of this idea that you have of direct experience and how much that helps with this process of sort of bridging these difficult skill sets and understandings of what we're supposed to do in certain situations. And you did the same with other extreme environments as well. You learned to skydive and you became a safety scuba diver as well. Just tell us a little bit more about this direct experience approach to complement study and the importance of being able to, as you put it, speak the language of those operating in these extreme environments. Just zoom in on that for a bit.
Sure. That's a really good, perceptual noticing that, you're bringing into conversation, because it's almost like when I'm flying with a pilot, let's say, and we're doing an observational flight, I know when to ask questions, and when they're looking, I have an understanding what they might be looking. I don't have, because we could look but not see. We could look, see, and not remember. There is a sequence of a lot of aspects that we assume that people's done something because of the motion of what they've done, but it not necessarily it got processed or absorbed or filed, if you wish. And so by having an experience, you understand what the state of their alertness is, because in all of this, there's a chemical balance, right? That's in our body. If we are flooded with information, which is the physiology that I studied in clinical psychology, we have our perception narrow. So it's called tunnel vision. So in understanding all of those aspects when they come in, but like how important in pilots is peripheral vision, which they use when they're landing, which they don't actually, they do look at the keys, at the piano keys, but what they're referring to in terms of, they don't say how fast the aircraft come down, but they say how fast the Earth is coming up. So, and that's an interesting, very subtle difference. But then if you actually in your mind switch that perception to see how fast the Earth is coming up, you it's more tuned in, more fine perception. Why? I have no idea. It would be nice to study it in that understanding, but it gives more clues perceptually. And our peripheral vision is much more tuned in for fast movement, which our forward vision doesn't have that capacity just because of physiology. And when the person is stressed, so hence the experience of understanding on how fast things happen, and that you just have to move on. It's just like past, 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 and that is really aligns with thinking on your feet, but also not pilots in the way they think is that they don't get stuck in the past. That transfers to their actual life. So they often, well, anyway, in my experience, they don't hang grudges, which is quite interesting, isn't it? How that your professional life gets into your social and relations, because you just have to stay ahead. It's too late to think who did what. You need to sort it out what you can do right now. So that experiential component helped me to ask questions at the right time, to place attention where it might be difficult, where the information is overloaded, because I have experienced that. And that gives you an opportunity then to design the study, to design an experiment in such a way that then you can include the physiological measurements, because that's what will have an effect. You can ask the right questions, and in the interview before or after, you know which points to accentuate. And that's what I mean. It's just as soon as I had the experience and started asking questions, I was asking them almost from their perspective rather than from my perspective. And that somehow opens up a window, and a person doesn't feel anymore like you kind of looking from the same point, and you're saying, look at that. And so, yeah, I can see that. It's giving you a similar perspective that you can study it from. And that eliminates additional questions, and the person relaxes because they don't need to, like what you have, chasing consciousness or chasing somebody's mental models. So I can, let's say for your audience, you have built up your audience. I don't know what your audience knows, but you do. And you are asking the questions to model what they will understand. And that's setting that foundation. And so when you are with the pilot speaking with the pilot, Airbus speaking to Airbus pilot, they don't have to chase that. They don't need to build a foundation. They kind of relax and say, well, how was your day? And they would say, that thing went off. And it's like, yeah, it happened to me last time. And they don't need to set the foundation. And the information flows very differently, more openly, less restrictive.
So alongside this cognitive engineering work and your clinical psychology work, you were led to developing new methods to work with this decision making, particularly to try and improve the performance. And you came out with an extraordinary result, 200% improvement in decision making time in pilots, a previously unheard of jump, given how split second pilots' decisions need to be anyway. And this unsurprisingly led to you being employed by the US Air Force, among others, to teach these methods. Perhaps by means of introducing how you developed such effective methods, you could tell us about this fascinating research on Australian firefighters' instant decision making, because I think that really inspired your research methodology quite a lot, didn't it?
Yes, just a tiny correction. I didn't get hired or worked for US Air Force, just so
Oh,
it's
right. Okay, I
clear. But what
misunderstood.
happened is that I did present my PhD results at the conference in London, and Wright Patterson Air Force Human Factors Lab experts were there that have a London office. And which are the US Air Force human factors experts, or this is like the the hub, which I really wanted to collaborate with and be in touch and do research, because I read all of their work. Of course, that informed my understanding of the field, which is very much, what I've been taught by Gavin Linton to be looking at. And so they actually funded my travel to go to. So the U.S. Air Force did fund the travel. So I didn't work for them, if you wish, but they have granted. It's like an award. And I have went to Wright-Patterson, I went to Boeing, I went to NASA, to be able to explicate what I did and share the methodology, just as you mentioned.
Wow.
So yes, apologies for the interruption. But could you ask me that question again? So
well, as a means
about
of
the methods.
introducing that method, because clearly
Okay.
this method sent ripples through the field.
Yes.
I know that you were hugely inspired by some research on Australian firefighters.
Yes.
And that kind of inspired some of your methodology, features like attaching cameras so you can
Yeah.
see the facial expressions and this kind of thing. Tell us a little bit about that research as a sort of springboard into the methodology you landed on in the end.
Yes. So again, coincidences happen. And I was right in the lab where Jim McLennan and Mary Omedy, they're a couple, and they both were fascinated in how people make decisions. And they started with something called retrospective interview or retrospective interview protocol, where, let's say, firefighters in training or in real operations come out. And as soon as you can, you do an interview with them. So while the memory and the events are fresh, and and there is also a strategy there to eliminate suggestion and to make sure that you are asking events as they unrolled, so you don't change the timeline. So there is just a strategy to preserve the memory and not be affected by something that you might want to share, but it's not related to the flow of the events. And they found that a lot of information gets missed out, and they would almost hear it in the corridors, as an after effect of what they've shared of the event versus what also happened at the event. Not that the person doesn't want to share it; it's just we don't cue them appropriately. That's the challenge as a scientific method. So what they thought, like, what if we actually document the event from the point of view of an individual? And at the time, it was very novel because we first time had lipstick cameras. This is like year 2000. And we had to still have tapes, the ones that are rolling tapes. And they had to, although they were smaller, but you had to have a battery pack for all of your equipment, which you also had to put on the firefighter. And they would run out really quickly. But it was the beginning of the methodology of starting to capture. And so they would record what was happening from the point of view at the eye level, and they would have all of their fire protection, which is a thermal protection, visual, transparent, but still it's heavy equipment. And as they go in and have done their walkthrough, then they would watch that walkthrough with the person as soon as they can, as soon as it's practical. And then what they did is that they let the person just watch the event. They didn't ask them any questions. And then they did the second run through. And in the second run through, they would ask questions and pause so the person can explicate what was happening. And once they start doing that, there would be a double, triple, quadruple time on that second that they stopped. It's like the flood of perceptual information, the processing, the thinking was happening that it's impossible to articulate otherwise. And so then they started to look at why do we have such better memory recall than in retrospective interview. They just been there, so it's not like it was that much different. And so what happened is that the perspective, just what we talked about earlier, just like me and the pilot talking, having experience flown an aircraft, although different, but we have that perspective, and we don't need to put on filters of and understanding, trying to explain the person, not the experience itself, but so they can understand. So I'm working like triple time, trying to make sure that I use the right terminology, that I don't overstep my bounds, that I'm respectful, all of this contextual, social, political contexts. And because they were looking from their own perspective, and their only task was they're not being watched, meaning that when we don't see ourselves, but in an interview, I can see you're looking at me. I know the audience would be looking. So I am filtering as I'm speaking, not necessarily on purpose. It's just social trained behavior. And but they don't need to do that because the only thing they're doing now is in their task. So they no longer need to explain why, they justify what they're seeing, because you can kind of see and feel the fire. You can see, and everybody's looking from the same perspective. So we're all having almost same vision into the reality of that event. And that allows the person to remove that cognitive processing that overshadows the perceptual clues that are coming in and what am I actually thinking. So you're not detangling the lines like glue, apart of kind of social behavior, appropriateness, understanding what they know, what I know, how can I articulate it, what's my storyline. There's none of that. You don't need construct, you just flow with experience. And then the information started to flood in such beautiful way that they have possibly saved many lives as a result. Is that one of the kind of leading trainers will actually remove the flap of the ear, which meant to be protective. But they said that they have to feel the movement of the wind, of the air, of the fire. They called it the movement of fire because they could feel it breathing, they said. And that intensity in temperature, in motion, change in direction would tell them where the intensity might have cause a collapse of a building, for example, because it's damaged so much, because they would get out seconds before and not leave anyone behind, versus, if you leave too early and you have people still there, you don't want to lose the crew or the people, but you also don't want to lose lives unnecessarily. And that split decision helped train other other firefighters to explain to them those little nuances. And this is just one. And so from that, the training improved dramatically.
And you applied that to your pilot training
That's right. Yeah.
methodology. Can you just describe what is the method of, it sounds such a difficult thing to teach. I'm a teacher, and, we always have this block of concepts and words and, language differences. How did you make that into a training methodology to achieve such impossible results?
So the 200% of improvement in speed. So they were calculating something that they need to do in the air regularly, the pilots. As part of the objective of your PhD, you have to demonstrate that you can do research independently, but also you try to advance the science if you can, or you reapply the methodology, in a different field. There are many ways of doing it. So in this case, part of cognitive engineering, and that what Gavin Linton was really strong, and Jim McLennan and Mary Ormady were trying to understand the decision-making process. So we were all kind of weaving together the stories, and also Dr. Pam Anderson is also Sanderson that I worked with. So the idea is that to see how my interest is that how can I layer the information on the display so that it is intuitive, because and the word intuition was not a word to speak of, and even professional intuition was not being acceptable, and it was only just starting to infiltrate to say, well, actually there is a knowing, and we can't use any other words. It is a professional knowledge that entangles, but we can't always say how it came together. So they started to use professional intuition. And what I was interested in is that how can we make this such a easy way to react to rather than process and calculate, because we now have this incredible capacity to lay information any way we want. We're not restricted by errors anymore. We can just do a Picasso if we wanted to. And so I was looking at various methods on how people react, what we react faster to, visual. I was looking at how we respond to color, to shapes, to motion. I had to learn Pascal language to program it, which was not my forte, but we had to do an actual prototype that I could use on the computer, and it was very, very basic, but it resembled with exactly what the pilots would see, but just a single display. And my interest is that, well, if they're doing this hundreds of times per flight, as they climb up, they have to level off at a certain altitude. And to level off at a certain altitude, you have to anticipate when that will happen. And through, you don't always have visual reference because you're on cloud, right? There's no lines in sky to say where that altitude is. So you look at instruments. And before they would collate information for altitude, a speed of ascent or vertical speed, and they have to manipulate throttle, how fast the aircraft is going, and it's all of that had to be coordinated. And then some of them would do it absolutely perfectly, and I wanted to see how can I help them to do this visually, so that they don't need to do these calculations because they were taught by calculation. If you reduce at this altitude, let's say vertical speed this much, reduce the throttle, and watch the displays change, and you slowly kind of gain that alignment, and let's say gain the altitude at the right time, at the right vertical speed, and level off, because it's critical in busy airspace. And so I started to look into what are we good at in perceiving, what are we bad at, which is calculating, and or we could make mistakes, most likely. And I started to study what would work for them, and through using the camera, I was trying to understand where they're picking up the clues on the more modern displays and also analog. And that gave me an idea of what they're looking and what is helpful and not helpful. And merging these aspects, I came up with something called design principles, which is normal. Every cockpit has a design philosophy, and design display principles allow you to dictate so that Airbus and Boeing have a similar, or manufacturers that produce displays don't mismatch with other displays in terms of their philosophy. So, like, for example, they can use the same abbreviation meaning different things, and that will be confusing. And at a time of information overflow, would be misunderstood. And that's exactly what happened in many accidents. So I've overlaid that, designed displays based on what the engineers were doing or capable of doing on displays, and what pilots were thinking. And through the experimentation, I had pilots running through these displays that I designed, and they were able to make a decision much faster than analog, and or in the dial kind of displays with errors. But what was more interesting, they also made significantly less errors, which was another big problem. Is that and the errors we make because we're not meant to be calculating. We're not designed to calculate, but we are designed to navigate visually quite well. And that's why learning to fly helped me to understand, what cues they're using. And by understanding that, if you wish, it was my professional intuition to put those together. Because what long discussions that we had with Gavin Linton is that you need to write it in such a way, your thought process has to be such that somebody can take it and replicate it. There must be no gaps. There is no intuition, that you would have to use in. It has to be absolutely clear where you took that decision to put that shape in, I don't know, so many pixels and so on and so on. So, and that was a beautiful process to understand, and trying to explicate my, if you wish, pre-verbal understanding and knowing of flying myself, and trying to help pilots explicate their experience and engineers to tell theirs.
I mean, it's an extraordinary result here, but it does show, as you said, that this old cognitive linear tree branch model
Yeah.
of reason-based decision making is just completely inept for this kind of high pressure split second situation. Instead, as you said, we've got this kind of interconnected multisensorial network of impressions happening on timescales far shorter than the frontal cortex could get involved in anyway. In fact, that would actually be damaging to try and re-reason in that situation. But I want to zoom in on this problem you noted about how to talk about it in the literature, because I guess the word, as you said, intuition is just too taboo. How did you and Linton and all the other colleagues you've mentioned start to describe this as a phenomena in the scientific literature? Because I imagine it was a challenge to come up with some terminology that could be credible in the context of the old psychological models.
Yes, of course. We all, advance science with generation. You have to reference certain colleagues because, they came to they walk the path. So in a way, you're doing the same process. You are watching how did they make up their results, or what was their thinking. So that's why you become so narrow, I guess, in your expertise, because you're also following other people. And the idea is to get into their thinking, to understand why did they come up to that decision. And that's why it's so vital to almost document your process, almost thinking process. And coming from psychology, it was helpful because I would be looking into how people think, as part of my profession, assisting people in processing information, sometimes emotional, social, and also professional or organizational psychology is also part of it. So by understanding how they thought and what methods they use, you understand the limitations of methodology, not the thinking of an individual, but it's just exactly that, what was accepted in science and how could they articulate what they were experiencing. And then documenting and creating research and writing textbooks. And it was so amazing because throughout my degree, I was able to travel to conferences and present. So we had this funding pot that allowed PhD students to go and engage with these experts. So you hear things behind the scene that they couldn't publish, and you would understand, how did they balance that? How do they balance what they understand, what they could publish, what they can't, but also it's not just that they couldn't publish; it's that they were still looking how to articulate that. So you had this opportunity to catch almost the advancement before they publish something. And that was helpful to construct the writing to say that you had a conversation and the publication is coming up, for example, because the field is advancing really fast because the cockpits were having so much problems and there was so much data coming in about errors in the aircraft. And in fact, there was, I think it was, I wanted to say, so the National Transportation Safety Board in the United States have analyzed many aircraft accidents, and they were about 50%. I mean, I don't remember now the dates, but about 50% was considered to be a human error or human factor, which means the pilot, or maybe in some cases air traffic control, let's say in navigation. But then when the cognitive engineering and human-computer interaction field went into motion, and we had much more understanding on what the cockpit design philosophy is, how do we design a cockpit, what information is processed and can be absorbed and can't be absorbed. All sorts of there were simulators in many universities, labs that you can access. Computers came into place. We could do, computer-based training, which means we could see what the pilots were seeing. And through all of that, we suddenly could see that actually the error was not human, in a sense, not the pilot. There were something called James Reason put something he called Swiss cheese model, which is where you've got the big hole. So when you slice the cheese, and the accident will only happen when all of these holes align, meaning there's a barrier of design, there's a barrier of training, there's a barrier of procedures, there is a barrier of weather, there's a barrier of air traffic control. So it's never one thing. So it's not, the pilot might be at the receiving end that has to, all of these conditions, all of the holes aligned, and they have to battle with it and make it work. But the errors were then, so all the accidents were then reanalyzed. They received the grant to reanalyze on errors, and there was only 20% or something to the pilot error, versus the original 50. So it depends, how we analyze, what veils we have. And so, yes, it was difficult to publish. It was difficult to say, as a young, scientist, to say, well, actually, I don't think this way of thinking applies. There was a model that suggested that our decision making was like a decision tree. Like, if this is the weather condition, yes, I follow this way. If I don't have that option, I follow no. Or there's no possibility in flight of indecision, right? But but also it doesn't happen like that, and that's what Jim McLennan and Mary Omedy have shown in their research, is that it's not linear. We don't know where the information.
Just to push down onto that specific terminology that you ended up with, I don't know. I mean, to me, it's coming something like sort of instant network, multifaceted decision making, or something like that. Was there a term that you fixed on in the end to kind of sum up this multifactorial, faster than reason decision making? Was there a word that bypassed the intuition taboo?
And no. So we still use professional intuition.
Professional intuition. Okay. No, it was
Yes.
just to get the word that you'd landed on.
And it was Garry Klein. I still have my all human factors books, but they're not here. But it was Garry Klein that started gently introducing that, not through publications, but he published the book that had very solid evidence, and that kind of shifted the pole, because Jim McLennan and Mary Omedy, that was their colleagues at the time.
So, yeah, quick tangent, but I think a relevant one. Before we get back to pilots and, of course, astronauts, space psychology, some surgeons in Britain heard about this research and they reached out as they were interested in the process of sharing knowledge about their skills in surgery, which is sort of a similarly split second, similarly multifaceted, very, very personal to each practitioner's skill set, and therefore similarly difficult to explain in words. And so you went on to do some experiments with them, right? Can you describe that research and what were your results? And of course, if there was any common ground with what you'd found with pilots' decision making.
So a surgeon, very open-minded surgeon, approached me during the conference, which was talking about decision making and situational awareness. And he said, I would like to know if we can capture the intuitive decision making, or the decision making that happens that's really hard to describe in words. I see the pattern. Basically, he was saying that we also do these flights, and altitude level off, if you wish, and do intuitive decisions in surgery when we're navigating the surgical field. And we would like you to try and apply your method to transfer expertise from an expert to a novice, But what we end up doing is actually transferring expertise to expert to expert, which is fascinating. And what was happening is in surgical training, like in flight, you have safety as a priority because you have people's lives at stake. And more so, surgery is regulated very rigorously because of previous errors. You have procedures that you have to go through in order not to make that error. So is in aviation as well. So it's kind of accident driven. Unfortunately, the safety field is accident driven, and you hopefully learn from the accident. So they unpack it, and when they unpack it, you should have followed the procedure. And generally, what was happening is that when a surgeon would be a training surgeon, would be training students, or they could be already qualified and graduated, but they're advancing to consultant qualification, and they would be teaching them not in the way they do surgery itself. So when the person is speaking and doing the surgery, they will do it slightly differently than when they are doing it without being observed by students, because it's maybe faster. They might see shortcuts that are appropriate and actually safe to take. They would almost bypass, and sometimes not that they are being complicit, right? So like making it on purpose, but they're actually seeing it that if I actually bypass this would be safer for the patient. Because if they take time, let's say, to do those extra steps, let's say they will stay under longer, I don't know, the blood supply will be cut off longer. There are many circumstances that you would want to speed up the time in process. So I said, yeah, I'd be delighted, but we couldn't get funding because it's on the edge of science, and because they haven't been formulated. How can you say, goals like that? About how do you transfer professional intuition, expert to expert, because we think that the old way of transferring is, works, and why change it? And so kindly this surgeons, so this is Kenneth Walker, and many of his colleagues just put up their time and found a small grant to make a travel compensation for me to go. University was happy for me to go. And we started using it first on endoscopy, which is a little camera that goes either way, at the top or the bottom, and watching, because it's a very difficult process, and often it can be done by endoscopist, but it also can be done by a surgeon who then will go in and actually do the surgery itself. And the idea is that they have this instrument which is more complicated than a military yoke. Yoke is the flying component of your flight where you hold, and they've got many, many buttons. So they have to manipulate the thumb, they have to press buttons, and it's like a 3D articulation camera. It's like directing a snake in the passage. But not only that, you have to make sure the light falls in the right place, you have the right speed, you don't get stuck in the turns, and you have to remember how you to drive it back in the same way as you drove in. So it's a very and one of the endoscopists said that he's actually used to fly. He used to fly. Anyway, he had a pilot license too, and he would say that I would imagine that I'm flying, and that would make it easier for me. And that's something came out that other surgeons did not know, endoscopists, and so they started to explain almost like those anticipations that otherwise you get stuck in, but they could articulate them in real time because they had this head-mounted camera, and they would have done the procedure. Nobody interrupted them, because if you interrupt the person with questions during the surgery, such as what is usually done, the surgeon is teaching you at the time of doing the surgery, they actually have to think. If you remember those sticky, wavy thinking lines and filters that happen as we articulate, you miss out a lot of that intuition that happens in the background because you have to manipulate many contexts. And so then, as they describe it, after the surgery, from their point of view, and the other expert, which we had two endoscopists side by side, because one of them was Ken, who was leading the study alongside, so we were doing it together. And he watched another endoscopist and said, I had no idea you're doing it that way. And they are two experts, cream de la cream, top of their field. And they always assume that the other colleague does it in the same way. But no, they all develop their own tricks. They don't teach because it's not part of the procedure, not how it's approved. But at least the expert to expert can communicate this, something that is they don't even know they know, and they absolutely don't know that the other person doesn't do it the same. So we've came to this beautiful intersection that enrich them instantaneously. So it's like hours of practice passed in seconds to another person. And so we had a lot of ideas, and we started some. We even created a prototype of how to do this electronically, World Wide Web expertise, such as because Ken, with his wife, who's a nurse, worked in Nepal. And he said, wouldn't it be amazing if Nepalese endoscopist or someone who has to use an endoscope had hours of our footage? And that means they would have seen, hours, 100 hours of those patients, because they would have seen the procedure and because they have, know how to use the instrument, but they don't have the experience, that is loaded on what has happened. And so, unfortunately, we didn't get anywhere because we couldn't fund it, but we had prototypes of all of that. And that was just the beginning. And they had another expert, which was the second practitioner that we used, was anesthesiologists, and they were doing epidurals. And to do an epidural, it's a complicated procedure, although it takes seconds to do. You have to insert the needle into a space that you are creating, and literally you're going blind because there is no the epidural is done between places in the spine to to create a space where you block the signals going up and down. So they have to literally, before they used to use air to create that space to block it through air by pushing it. But now they use liquid. And of course, there is also chemical component to that. And so the endoscopy, and when you go in, there's many levels of tissue. Apologies for the graphic explanation. And you have to go through those tissues by feel. You cannot teach it. You can design that tissue, for example, for a mock-up where the student, medical student, can learn how it feels, and they do this practice on oranges apparently. But an actual depth of tissue differs in every single person. So you have to, when you go with the instrument or the needle, you are feeling as you're passing every single layer, and everybody is different. Every space is different, and there's no one the same. So when they go in, they are literally taking a new journey. It's an exploration. It's like going, I don't know, to a new planet, the path that never ever been done before. And they have to translate that to another person. And so they had one surgeon, one anesthesiologist that been doing this past retirement age, and he was happy to do it, and they were happy to keep him because he was having much higher success rate, something like over 90% success rate in patient outcome than any other newly trained or any other experts behind him. But he was using old method, which was no longer allowed to be used, which was that through air. And it looked like he was being a nose-up person, meaning like, I'm good at it, I'm never going to share it with anybody, just going to stay at the top. But then once he put the camera on him and did he did the epidural and he started explicating to me, he couldn't stop. He talked longer than any other expert. It's like he was waiting for the moment when somebody will actually listen and something that he could articulate in the way that allowed him to remove all those filters. Like he's not allowed to do the procedure. This is not acceptable. You can't teach that. Like he had so much knowledge that was helpful, for new methods as well, that everybody, their jaw dropped and they said, what? He did, speak and he shared, and it's extraordinary. So that kind of sprung a new path for their field, and they had other surgeons starting to learn the method.
Well, I think it's a really good example, and I love the cross-disciplinary component of that, the way they picked that up from your presentation. We're like, oh, we can use that. So, listeners, we're going to come back to this, the component of what we've just been talking about, this non-verbal transfer of information in a little bit. But first, let's take this cognitive engineering decision-making research into the context of today's main topic, space psychology. Perhaps you can start here just telling us how your work with pilot psychology got you invited to work at the European Space Agency in the Gagarin Astronaut Training Center. What was the route into working directly with astronauts?
I always wanted to work with astronauts. That's why I learned to fly. That's why I learned to skydive, scuba dive, because that's all they do. They have to do for extravehicular activity. They have to scuba dive in order to feel
The weightlessness.
the weightlessness, but also practice the procedures in the suit. Although the problem is that because they use the same suit in training, it actually, or the same, I don't know if it's actually exactly the same, but it's the same, structurally built the same. They damage their shoulders, they damage, it's much more difficult to walk in the suit in the swimming pool than in extravehicular activity, because when you're in space, you're floating in the spacesuit, but in water, you're still working against the medium.
There's no resistance in the vacuum, yeah.
Yeah, but you also float. So this was Alexei Leonov, who was the first person to exit the spacecraft and be in the open space. He described, his, to me personally, I had the opportunity to speak with him on the accident that he had, where they did not know what will happen, when the person exits into open space. And do you know about that accident?
No.
So that might be relevant. Do you want
It's
me to?
a good story because I'm about to open up the ESA study that you led on,
Okay.
missions to moon, missions to the Mars, so
Yeah.
getting a sense of these early challenges,
Yeah,
I think is a
sure.
great opening to the psychological component.
Okay. So Alexei Leonov, he is a Russian cosmonaut. He was one of the first groups selected. So they were, cream de la cream military pilots who were testing pilots, but also, used all the latest technology. But also the reason he wanted to fly was actually not because of technology. He is a painter at heart. And he went into space because he wanted to fly, because space was not an option. He wanted to fly because he wanted to see the clouds closer, because he couldn't understand the texture. So that's why he learned to fly and went into aviation. And then he gets selected and works closely with Yuri Gagarin and all the forefathers of space flight. And so he's chosen to go into first person to walk in space in the suit, which is this unknown challenge, and we have no understanding what happens with a person, what happens with the suit, with the materials. We have tested, the how we can contain, let's say, oxygen for people in rockets and spacecrafts, but no one worked actually with soft materials. And so he's wearing the suit, which he had tested and tried in parabolic flight, which is when the aircraft goes very sharply up and then descends rapidly, imitating free fall. And that imitates as if you are in space, although you're actually falling as fast as the aircraft to the ground, and hope the aircraft will recover for another parabol. So, and he was coming in and out of the suit and learning to go in and out of the lock because he obviously the problem is that until we've been there, we can only imagine the type of things we need to do and problems we have to encounter. So they had this tube that they designed, thinking because in order to get into the spacecraft and out, you can't just open the door, right? It will just all zoom out, all the air, and everything gets sucked out into the vacuum because of the pressure. The air will be released where there's less pressure, so we'll be chasing the emptiness. And so they thought they will have this collapsible tube, and that collapsible tube, which could be inflated, and he could enter that tube. His colleague will lock the hatch, and so the oxygen will stay with inside the spacecraft, and they will air the oxygen from the tube, and he will then exit into open space. Logical, right? So that's what they're doing, and so he comes out into the tube, and what he practiced is actually to push, because they were concerned maybe that he would. I don't know what the concern was, but in essence, for some reason, they decided that he needs to push of this ring to open space so he can actually fly out. And he's connected by by umbilical cord. That's exactly what they've called it, where all of his oxygen supply, all the communication, everything that he needs is delivered to the suit. And so he pushes it, and he pushes it like he practiced in the parabolic flight, when they were falling down to Earth in the spacecraft. And he pushed too hard because he launched, because, there's this anticipation, there's chemical reaction, but he didn't do anything that was not planned. But because he bounces it so high, so far, the umbilical cord stretches and pulls him back. So he now bashes back because there's no resistance, right, into the spacecraft, and there's nothing to grab on the spacecraft. And this is coming back to something, or let's say looking forward to the first extravehicular activity, which was done by the US a bit later. And they also had the same problem, that they had no handles on the outside. So should they have shared, that Leonov had this problem when he exited, and he had nothing to catch on the outside aircraft because it's smooth, of course, for the aerodynamics. So he's bouncing and he can't stop it. He can't grab his umbilical cord because suddenly his suit is starting to expand, because the oxygen and pressure in it is much higher than the vacuum, and it's expanding in the suit, and he no longer fits the suit. And he's becoming like Michelin Man. He can't bring his hands together to grab anything because the suit is pushing him to be straight because of how it's stitched. So he's in this position, and more so, he's also his boots are coming off because it's stretching, in all direction, the suit. But luckily, his helmet remains. So now he has the challenge, and he's sweating a lot because he's working so hard to contain the motion, but also, to actually get back into the aircraft, because the understanding, for one, that the pressure is becoming too high, and he needs to reduce the pressure, but he can't go below what has been recommended because it's oxygen, right? But he needs to decrease the suit. But when does he need to do it? And and he's speaking with his colleague, which are deeply friend, much closer than, I don't know, partner ever be, because they go through such extraordinary experiences, and they're talking about the conundrum they're in, and understanding that this may not end well, but they're, as pilots, they're problem solving as it comes. And so he's coming back, and he understands that he needs to reduce the pressure of the suit to a degree way below that the mission control allows. And they're talking to mission control, but at this point, he's not listening on purpose. He's very computing, I guess, what is possible or not, because he can't enter the tube. But more so, the tube is designed in such a way that when he enters the tube, he needs to lock the hatch, because if he doesn't lock it, he can't enter the. He wouldn't be able, for one, that everything will be coming off, including his colleague. He wouldn't survive, but also there will be so much flow that he wouldn't be able. Anyways, so all of this is going through their mind, and this is split seconds. So he releases the pressure way below, and hopefully not passing out, but being able to get into the tube. But also he needs to turn around in this extraordinary suit in very tight space, which is unrealistic. They barely turned it, in their simulation in parabolic flight. Has to close the hatch, and then they need to regulate the pressure, and he needs to enter the craft. So nobody knows how it was not physically possible in the expansion of his suit for him to turn around. He actually does. And he lost, I think they had several liters of sweat in his suit, and he lost so much weight in that exercise, which was, last minutes.
Amazing
But
example, yeah.
yeah,
And just sorry, before we get on to all of your study of these kind of scenarios in order to then train astronauts for much bigger missions, just how did you get in with the
okay.
ESA? Did you were you invited because of your previous experience, or was it once again quite similar? It happens a lot in science where you found people who were doing what you were interested in, you contacted them, and you slowly worked your way in that way.
So I had a colleague that I worked with before, Anna Brosebeck, Dr. Anna Brosebeck, extraordinary human factors expert. She works now in Switzerland. But at the time, we were working together at the University of Bath, and she said, "Iya, there is this position, and they're looking for someone with your expertise, but it's to do with space, because there is a
And you were like, yeah.
because there was they were applying for a call, and if this call doesn't happen, I wouldn't get the job. But they're applying for a call that is first time since Margaret Thatcher, because Margaret Thatcher cancelled human spaceflight participation in the UK. So meaning that UK is not contributing to that part of European Space Agency programs, and that means we can't do research or get funding to do this type of work. And so this was human spaceflight research, but it was given at something called general study, which means all countries could bid in, despite which program they pay in. So it was unusual. And of course, all countries are bidding, and some countries work already in space psychology, and they have expertise. And someone who really helped me also Dietrich Manzi, a German space psychologist who I would say also a forefather of space psychology. And so I thought, okay, I must. So I go for an interview, and I said, I'll write the grant, no problem. If we get it, we get it. We don't, we don't. And so we write the grant with my other colleague, who is Dr. Olga Bogatyreva. She is a biologist, and she's already working at University of Bath, and she is helping engineering department to apply nature's laws for engineering solutions, so biomimetics. And she's first in her field with her husband and Dr. Nikolai Bogatyrev. And they and what I wanted to do with them, the idea for this particular grant was the question was designing tools for psychological support for long duration missions to the moon and Mars. And the idea was we had to come up with all possible psychological issues that will happen and provide tools for them in a year. Like, why not? It's just a minor task. So
Yeah,
And I
that's my next question, and I just wondered if it obviously all got written up in a book that the listeners can read as well. This
yes,
toolkit for a space psychologist. But I just wondered if you could go into some of the many issues, things like isolation, claustrophobia, crude interpersonal dynamics, lack of
yeah,
gravity, limited diet, restricted movement, lack of green space, all of these
yeah,
things which we take for granted because we just see the movies of these guys, doing their job, but we don't think about the psychological components. Can you
yeah.
just take us through, in your opinion? I mean, we won't have time for all of them, but just a few of the really important ones that really came out as being fundamentally important for the interventions you then went on to recommend.
So the foundation of all of this is the methodology, because methodology is what was lacking at the time to classify the type of issues we're likely to encounter in exploration missions. And what I saw, and this is why the cross-disciplinary work is so valuable, because I was familiar with Olga's and Nikolai's work, that where they mapped, so they started with teaching theory of innovative problem solving to to engineers because they had to make a living, because the academics were not paid, and they are from the Academy of Science in Russia, the top level in Siberia. There was like a camp, if you wish, an institute that they were from that. So they were again cream de la cream. And they studied biology and behavior of bees and ants, but also they were aware of biological principles. That they had an extraordinary foundation, not only in behavior but also in mechanisms. And they saw that theory of innovative problem solving, which was developed by someone called Altshuller. He was a patent clerk who was working in the patent office filing the patents in Russia or in Soviet Union. And he looked and saw that people actually solving it the same way, although it's innovative in, let's say, chemistry, it's not innovative in engineering. So he saw that the people are solving, or let's say mechanical engineering and electrical engineering. He saw the similarities, and he started to analyze and pouring in and saying, well, actually, they're solving this problem, this contradiction, or solving the weight value somehow that it's not working in time. And he started pulling these principles and created a table of, I think it was over 70 problem solving methods. Then he distilled them shorter and they became 40 principles. And so Olga and Nikolai thought, well, if human mind can design and innovate, and nature is essentially innovating the solving problems in the same way, what if we look how nature solves problems, and how it will fall into the same principles, into the same map. And so they started looking for nature's examples on how this same problem or contradiction, how we specified, is solved by nature. And what they found, that there was something like 75 to 80% mismatch. So, so nature solved it 75% differently than the humans. So they solve the problems in a different way. And how? The major foundation was is that nature doesn't ask for new resources. It uses resources right here because it cannot travel to Antarctica. Although we do know that, desert sand in Africa nourishes Amazon by airways, but we found this now. But anyway, so it has to use resources available here. And so they distilled that and created creative problem solving map of biotrees, or theory of inventive problem solving by biology. So they are the founders of biomimetics. And I said, like, look, if we do the same thing, but for psychology, because psychology is also a problem, right? A disorder is a problem. And then we're trying to solve this with particular tools, right? So I said, how about we apply what you do to what I know? And so we took, diagnostic systematic manual, which is the DSM, and I think at the time was DSM-4. I started with 3. I think now the numbers are increasing rapidly. This is where we update with new disorders and descriptions. The more science happens, we describe it differently with symptomology, and how can we address it with advancement of science and techniques. And I thought, because I thought we can't take this diagnostic systematic manual of, that used by psychiatry and psychologists, clinical psychologists, and then provide solutions for Mars mission. We can't, because you can't do this. So I thought, what if we define the problems and then look for solutions just like they did in nature and just like they did in engineering? So Olga and I sat down and we had, like A4 papers like this that we glued in massive lineups that was lying across our dining, kitchen, living room. And we would be writing we started reviewing the literature, the studies that have been done, isolation studies, exploration missions, such as Antarctic missions that happened, way before we went to space, military operations. Even we looked at prisons, situations in prisons. We looked at submarine. We looked at firefighters. We just looked people looking away from family. So I had the Dr. Raymond Hamden, who did my clinical practice. I did it in Dubai. And he worked with people who live away from family or come because, they had a problem or they wanted to make money for a short period to start a life somewhere. There's many reasons of why people come to these hubs that some stay, but then some go because they would have either accomplished or the family needs them. And so he had an understanding of how people deal with being away from support systems. Yeah, for social family support. And some people, would send money, majority of their money, like monthly salary back home. And India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Philippines, that was the case. And, European families also did that. And so by having all of these people, and also studies that were published and diaries of people that been to this, climbing Everest, we distilled the type of problems people experience. Because I can't understand where this depression come from, where does an anxiety come from, and I can't pack all the medication into the aircraft, to use traditional, let's say, chemical approach. So we started looking on where is the symptoms. How can we detect the symptoms? Because in space flight and safety system, you look at prevention. If you can prevent it, you don't need to treat it. And if you know how to prevent it, then you can either train it, you can either monitor it, or you can talk about it if it's starting to rise. Because it's psychology, you can solve some things through discussion. And so by mapping that, we found that we could have a really good library. And this is where Diedrich Manze, the psychologist and professor of space psychology in Germany, helped me with all the literature that he accumulated. He literally let me look at all of his library. And I sat and went, and he gifted a lot of literature to me that he no longer needed, or it was becoming published in other ways that we could access. And and uh, and so now we have this matrix of there were over 2,000 symptoms or factors that would create a problem, that could define that what is likely to happen in Mars or Moon mission or expedition, right? Or Antarctic mission or on ISS, anywhere really. It's just that we were adding other factors. And depending how many factors you can specify that peoples interact with, which is what you do in problem solving, you resolve factors that are conflicting with each other with innovative solution. And we defined 36 categories that we exhausted pretty much every possible option of, we didn't need any other cells to define the problem that we found in literature, that we found in interviews, that we found in discussion, that we found in submarines, Antarctic missions. The psychologists work with people who live away, with firefighters, with submariners, prisoners, like space studies, isolation studies. By that time, there were many isolation studies done simulating missions, long duration missions.
And yeah,
And
just
that,
to give us an idea, could you just zoom in on one of those, just for
okay,
example, and talk about how you then developed shall we say, a protocol or an intervention, and often preventative, as you said,
yeah,
just to give us a case study, because we're not going to be
sure.
able to go through all of them, are we?
Yeah, of course. So one of them was something that is very mundane. It's not even, let's say, psychological problem when we think it on Earth. But let's say things get tired, meaning they get broken. Like let's say, I have this
Wear and
book,
tear. Yeah.
that I use for my phone, and it's starting to disintegrate and break. And you don't have that replacement, let's say, in space. It could be a handle, it could be quite vital, it could be used something every day. And although we exhaust in engineering, but we cannot, see how long the life shelf of something, let's say, in enclosed space for over a long time, in the new equipment. And some things will break, some things will peel off. And you know how, I don't know, every time you come to some door and you just can't open it, it jams all the time. Or every time you come here and it's sore for your eyes to see how, I don't know, the paint is faded, and things like that, that seemed mundane, but then it becomes somebody has to fix it, but somebody doesn't fix it, and it becomes a social issue because you face it and somebody doesn't clean after themselves, or because they used it in such a way it broke, and people start to play in their mind. And this is the first test problem that they do in British Antarctic missions, where they send the crew to a weekend where they're just left to themselves and they have to find out about each other. Flooded. It's called flooding. Yeah. And that's when you find out that the problems are actually not because you can't apply your skills. It's just because you can't take somebody snorting all the time. You can't take somebody, personal hygiene. You can't take somebody looking at you in a certain way, or, peeking at you on what you're doing or something, like being those very mundane things. And then when that encompasses with things like that we can't help it that we sweat, we can't help it that we, I don't know, have certain facial expression because we're not aware of it, or because things break and you have a habit of, swearing, I don't know, or not doing anything about it and just walking out and, sorting it out later. So all of those things we could map and they would come up in those matrix. So we had a week, 3 days, I think it was, 2 intensive days, and where we got all of these experts also together in European Space Agency in Noordwijk in Netherlands. And they, for every one of those two factors that came together, had to come up with a solution that did not require medication. So then we start, having all these extraordinary people with extraordinary experiences, physical lived experiences, tell us such a number of ideas on how we can prevent it. And having, Olga, who, knows how nature thinks and also seeing how this can be applied. So we were problem solving in a way that no psychology ever did in terms of prevention, not sorting it when the problem happens. And we found out that to get anxious, to get depressed, actually, you can prevent it way ahead. And we had Seligman, who is a Professor Seligman, who is a father of positive psychology, was also with us who was the pioneer in psychology of fostering prevention. So not coming to a psychologist with a problem, but seeing how you can improve yourself. So he's a forefather of positive psychology. And that suddenly spurred up with so many opportunities that we could use computers, we could use, what was coming up now, what now we call AI, but it was just bringing up the types of training, the type of discussions, the types of dialogues we could do. So all of these interventions started to pull in. And really, things like those interventions, like going to a weekend retreat with the people who are going to go for a mission, solves many problems that we come up in isolation studies, we come up on ISS, we come up on exploration missions. But if you talk that through first and make people to experience it, that prevents it. But for some reason, let's say we don't have that luxury still when we're bringing together internationally the crew, because they're chosen, through a specific process. Their time come up to go into space because they've been waiting in line for a long time. They're expert in that area, and we need expert in that area. So the crew is formed not by personality, but by all of those factors. That Swiss cheese that aligns, and then the problem either is prevented or not. But for people to live through the problem and to recognize it, because once why we train astronauts and all people working in safety critical environment, including surgeons, firefighters, is we train them so that they don't need to be flooded chemically when something happens unexpectedly. Our natural reaction is to freeze and take in what's happening, and then we can start to take into action. So we remove this first reaction of freezing by flooding them with as many as possible scenarios that could take them, jolt them in a way. And avoiding that jolting allows the person to then think clearly, because they know first three steps that they need to do. So their mind is already on the run. And once it's running, it can keep going. It's a beautiful tool. We must use it, the most effective way. And this is what allowed to then create different training scenarios that are social, that are psychological, that we are now, that's why coaching is, life coaching and many other disciplines are coming up, because people want to prevent the problem. They don't want to get into a problem. They
And
want
that
to,
was my
yeah.
next question here, was about these real live training programs. Good example is the Mars 500 in Russia in 2010-11, which was a 520-day mission for an international crew of 6. Again, emulating not only the very long journey to there and back, but also the surface exploration. My question was, did putting that into reality, again, this experience-based study, bring anything up that your studies hadn't anticipated? I'm sure something came out that you were like, oh my God, we didn't think of that.
Well, actual fact, it was happening in parallel, and no, we have accounted for all of that.
Amazing.
But not because we were brilliant, it's because the method worked, and because we had many brilliant experts who had went through that experience themselves. So when we all put these minds together, put these experiences and paths traveled together, we get this matrix, which is called a psi matrix, where we can go and look, I guess, what the forefathers and mothers, went through, and see how they solved it. And it's a knowledge management, which is another area that I came across when I was working in industry, is that you have these people leaving and you can't encapsulate their expertise. And there's been many efforts when I was in commercial industry, in aviation especially, or aircraft building and software engineering, that it disappears, and then you lose the know-how, and the new people have to reinvent, although it's been done before. So mapping that in through matrices like this, where people have solved this problem before. Nature has been there way before us. It's much more adaptive and innovative. And actually, adaptation is innovation, and that's Olga's Bogatyreva phrase. And so we're adapting all the time. So it's how to do this efficiently and beneficially to all around. Because once you start problem solving, which is what you're mentioning, Mars 500 study, they did not experience all the problems that we've mapped because we've mapped from all sorts of domains, but they had highlights that confirmed that we are not exiting, if you wish, the parameters. And this matrix only can be expanded. It's not a limited, it's a living document because the more factors you identify, the richer the field becomes. But it doesn't, it wouldn't, the cells would expand, but the categories so far are robust. But it doesn't mean that it shouldn't, you know?
But presumably that the active experiential led study there is fundamental. I'm assuming that all astronauts being considered for these long distance
Yeah.
missions would have been put through some quite serious isolation training, just as you say, to get used to all of these things to then prevent them when you're in space.
Absolutely. So, not all space agencies do isolation studies. And in fact, I don't, well, that's in Russia. I do know that they had some cosmonauts do go through isolation study, but it's not a norm. It's just because they were doing a study and they wanted somebody on the inside who has the space flight experience. But sometimes they even put those who are cosmonauts but haven't been to space yet as well.
It seems like a brilliant idea of
But
training.
yeah, but it isn't. It isn't a mandate. They do sleep deprivation, which is also an isolation for a week or 5 days, but it's not. It's got a different component. I mean, no other space agency does it, and
What about the space colonization component? Because obviously we're talking about much longer times and distances. Now, an example of that was the now abandoned Mars One project. We've
yes,
also got these young astronauts like 23-year-old Alyssa Carlson training and preparing psychologically for a, potentially one-way trip to Mars and to found a long-term Mars mission. Notwithstanding the serious funding issues of these really long-term projects, what are the ethical and psychological considerations of this type of futurism? I mean, surely humans couldn't even survive the exposure to cosmic rays for that long, let alone be resilient to the strains of long-term life in space.
well, it's not uncommon for us to take these leaps. Our
We adapt.
ancestors,
We
yeah.
adapt, as your colleague said, we're nature.
Yes, and we also travel to places that we've never been. We did not know if we'll return. So Antarctic missions, sailing to Americas from Europe, and so people have taken those leaps. It's not new for humanity to go places not knowing whether you come back or not. So that journey is done, and there's a motivation for it of different motivations. Some people want to get away, some people want to test themselves, some people want to be explorers, some people want to earn money, and you can trace that in the diaries of explorers, of why they've done it. And sometimes we don't fully understand why we do it either, but it could be the excitement, but we don't realize what we get into later on. But so it's not novel concept for us to go beyond places where we have never been. If we're talking about settling on Mars, I mean, the people who will choose to go, they would, they would be rigorously tested. They would be rigorously selected for expertise. They would be rigorously selected for why they want to do it. And so I've been asked this many times, what kind of questions would you ask people who would want to go to one-way mission? So you need to, because in a sense, some people's motivation could be thinking about it, this is, I'm forwarding the humanity. So if you look at cosmonauts, and I'm sure astronauts was exactly the same when you are now reading their diaries, that they said that they knew they're not likely to come back from every single journey because there's so many things that go wrong, and we were lucky, literally lucky, that we had such a good track record in. But I mean, the aircraft has better flight track record than rocketry in terms of number of people. But the you could consider of what the motivation of an individual is. So a person who is choosing to leave everything behind, have nothing to come back to, is not the person I would want to pilot my craft. As they say, if I skydive and pilot the aircraft, they don't feel very much secure because if I've got my parachute and I can actually fly the plane, that wouldn't be much confidence in the pilot, right? Because they wouldn't be directed to land the plane because they have another ways of exiting. So you want to, by taking that journey, if the life is precious to you, and we do hope that everybody would be precious about their life, then consider why people want to do this. For what kind of motivation they have. Are they exploring it for themselves? Are they exploring it for humanity? Are they exploring it for science? Are they equipped to deal with unexpected? Have they dealt with unexpected? Something very first you want to ask is that, have you come across a situation when somebody is dying in front of you or died? It's inevitable. People who go on Antarctic missions, they had that happen. You don't have to go far. And it's some people adapt and they become more, they find out more about themselves and the humanity and what they're capable and what they can offer, what they could be for others. And this rises, our understanding of what is mean being human. So I don't see why it's such a big deal in a way. If people want to go and they have the equipment and we're prepared, well, why didn't we not stop explorers, before? So, but yeah, considering all the options, all the factors, have a good problem-solving team available. They're trained in all this problem-solving, and you can only be equipped as far as you could. And my personal journey so far is how can we equip each one of us with the tools that we don't need to take anything extra. That's why I studied Korean medicine. So I'm a practitioner of Korean medicine, which I did not put on my CV for many years, but I studied it since early 20s. And I'm a teacher and I studied closely. It's like a parallel way of life. And it's the tools that I can look after myself. I can, survival training is of interest to me. How do we use plant medicine? How can we, be in the forest and know how to survive in all weather, in all conditions, and, support others? So it's, there was this beautiful analogy. So I worked as a clinical psychologist and we had Dr. Murray. He had actually he actually had a radio program, but he gave me the tapes that I could listen. And one of them was saying that when in a partnership or in marriage, he was a marriage counselor. He said the most robust family would be when you are traveling in two self-sustaining boats and you just happen to be traveling in the same direction. So then you can go visit each other on each other's boat and enjoy each other's space and place. But if the storm hits and one of your boats is damaged, you can completely take someone on board. and be happy and help them reconstruct their boat. So if another storm happens, you still have two independent boats. And but as soon as this weighs and you become dependent to such a degree that you cannot help yourself or others, that becomes difficult to travel. Then you lose the direction and you have to follow the direction of the person who is leading the boat. So I thought that was a beautiful analogy to say that, okay, I am looking for tools to keep myself well so I could be assisting others. And that's what most astronauts and cosmonauts that I came across. They are plumbers, they are negotiators, they're linguists, they play instruments often, they're amazing problem solvers. Anything for them is a joy to do. Any new task, it doesn't matter what it is, but they would just say, "Oh, let's look at this. Let's dive into this."
Flexible and curious, yes.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, it's a challenge. I'm on for it.
So, listeners, you may find that me and Ia, we look and sound slightly different. That's because we had to wrap up our the first part of this conversation because we had to rush off and go and get our kids from school. But now we're back because we really wanted to finish this conversation so you can get the full picture. So, moving straight back into it, Ia, so the listeners don't see much of a gap. I wanted to speak next to you about how many astronauts return to Earth so changed by their otherworldly experience. They often have difficulties reintegrating into quotidian life and relating with their previous terrestrial relationships. Particularly strong is what's known as the overview effect, common among astronauts when they see the Earth from above for the first time. William Shatner, the actor who played Captain Kirk in the original Star Trek series, has recently returned from space, having been invited by Jeff Bezos on one of Blue Origin's reusable rockets, only to return in tears, overwhelmed by this profound grief, recognizing Earth's fragility and humanity's destructive impact on it. He also commented on the contrast between this vast black emptiness of space and this sort of tiny, warm, nurturing oasis on Earth. And I think the first person to describe this was the Apollo astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who was so struck by these mystical experiences that he later went on to set up the Institute of Noetic Sciences to investigate that and similar anomalous states of consciousness. Incidentally, listeners, IONS is now led by my previous guest, Dean Radin. If any of you want to go off and find out more about that fascinating research coming out of IONS. Now, Edgar Mitchell later identified his experience as what Eastern philosophy calls a samadhi experience. So, a profound sense of unification with all things, a dissolution of the ego, and an awareness of reality's true interconnected nature. Certainly not the kind of experience you come away from unchanged, right here. And I imagine it's really not easy for them to describe this in words, and hard for their friends and their family to understand when they get back to normal life on the ground. Tell us about these semi-mystical, life-changing overview experiences and why they might be relevant to space psychology.
That's a beautiful introduction. And thank you for, I guess, mapping the people who have created something that the foundation that we could work from, start to discuss. And it's interesting that the name of the person is Frank White, who has written a book based on the interviews he conducted with astronauts called An Overview Effect. And that's how the term become popularized, but also provides a good reference for people to understand. In essence, this is a way of having a profound shift in values, shift in reevaluating our behaviors, reevaluating our belief system, which is not unknown in history. So Diana Pasulka has written about that, about study of how beliefs are formed. Also, Jeff Kripal writes about this. Whitley Strieber, wrote about this in Communion. And I think it's worth mentioning that there is almost a perception who's a scientist and who's not. But in my view, what the work that his wife, Anna Strieber, and Whitley Strieber has done research well beyond what PhD would be in the Communion. If you know that they have received over 250,000 letters through their letterbox. So can you imagine Harry Potter when those letters were streaming through the mailbox as an invitation to go to study in the school? And so the same was happening with Anne and Whitley as they were receiving these letters. And just to give a perspective, previously they would receive about 30 or something when they would, when Whitley would write a book. But this book, well, actually, his personal account, and so that's his original book with the visitors and the cover of this, which became iconic view of what the aliens look, right, later in films as well. And so based on his story, people felt acknowledged that there is this experience, and Whitley's written a beautiful way of what happens with the person thinking process. Because he's a writer, he's able to capture that inner state and write it almost like as if it's a novel, as if it's not about him, but it was the intensity of the experience. And people recognize this doubt that you have and not able to connect the timelines. And how do you explain this to your loved ones? And this is not far off in shifting our belief system or having a profound experience in what happens with, people go to war and experience similar experiences as well. People go on, Mount Everest and exploration missions. So it's not just bound by, having a birth of a baby, would have that shift very often in parents. So Whitley and Anne has collated, and actually Anne read every single letter. So can you imagine 250,000 letters read? And she categorized them together with Whitley, and they created categories of the types of experiences people had. And there is another beautiful book called The Spirit Molecule by Rick Strassman. And I would say they are alike in bringing the types of experiences that happen in the tests that he ran, actually under government-funded psychedelic research. And here Whitley is filing, and also I'm not sure they've even crossed paths, before. But this gives you a study of what kind of experiences people have. And that book allowed for people to see, and most of the letters began, I'm a policeman, I am a teacher, I am a lawyer, I am, I've been driving trucks for all of my life, and, secure, safe, established, parent, or they have a status, respect a status, and they go for that before telling the story, because it's almost like this is so unbelievable for the person themselves that they need to tell the story. And what's beautiful about these stories is because they are written with a listener who's already opened up and told like the whole journey of what has happened to them.
Yeah,
And
can I interrupt for a moment just to ask,
yeah,
are you talking about phenomena experiences,
yes,
so UFO anti-experiences, or are you talking about overview effect
oh,
experiences?
sorry, yes, so you're correct to ask. Yes, I'm making a parallel of these profound experiences that change us and change our worldview and belief system. So I'm talking about Whitley and Anne Communion book. which talks about experience with extraordinary ways of experiencing unidentified anomalous phenomena. And they would be usually happening not necessarily, well, there are those that would be, for example, seeing something, but it could have in various states of our wakefulness, if you wish.
And your idea here is that these have a similar life-changing, perspective-changing effect, which could be difficult to then reintegrate back into your quotidian life.
Exactly. And this is, and so these people similarly would not talk to anyone else, just as astronauts for a long time would not be able to articulate those experiences. And if they do, they would use a framework to articulate it. And this is something I would like to accentuate the point is that we who are listeners of astronauts, and especially if astronaut is telling the story, it's told to the public, to the general audience, or to the public, in public lecture on, let's say, TV interview, and their story is affected incredibly so on what they share.
Well,
And
if
so,
it's okay, yeah, because
yeah.
this is my next question, which is about those specifically intense and extraordinary experiences for both pilots and astronauts.
Yes.
I'm just going to go straight into that question, and you can talk to us about how all of this is dealt with by the psychological evaluation component. Now, since the New York Times Leslie Kean articles in late 2017 and early 2018, which covered some of these now famous military pilot UAP sightings, for which there was footage, radio, audio, and also radar data as well, and which this same articles exposed the top secret Pentagon ATIP program to investigate them, and also quoted Senator Harry Reid admitting that both the reports and ATIP were real. So since those articles, mainstream news and mainstream scientists, even Congress itself, have felt much more free to talk about this topic seriously after more than 70 years of ridicule and taboo. And now, because of the importance of reliable sources like fighter pilots to the credibility of those claims and the claims of the New York Times article, your specialization here in pilot performance and incident reporting for both military and civilian organizations led to you being called to interview quite regularly on mainstream television about this topic. Something would have been unheard of before 2018, wasn't it? For example, William Shatner again for Fox interviewed you, also by the National Geographic Channel. So what I wanted to ask you about was about how tough it must be for those pilots and astronauts to come to terms with these kind of experiences, let alone share them with others publicly. You've drawn attention in the past not only to the fact that pilots rarely talk about these experiences because of fear of being grounded or losing their careers on psychological grounds, but also because of the fear of ridicule from their colleagues. In fact, that is exactly what the pilots in the Nimitz article said. They said, we just don't talk about these things, even between each other. It's kind of an unspoken rule. But you also point out that they might occasionally speak to other pilots if they're close friends and if they can trust them. Now, you're a pilot that they can trust because you speak the same language as you mentioned earlier. Just how tough is it for these witnesses? And what have you come to understand about this bizarre UFO phenomena in speaking to such credible pilots?
Ryan Graves would be a good reference, I guess, that would be. He's the voice of speaking for pilots and speaking for safety because he is and
He was interviewed in those articles, wasn't he?
so Ryan Graves was in the Congress hearing 2024, and Ryan was an active pilot on duty, I believe, when he was interviewed first. And that was brought up by Ryan because he was responsible for safety on the Navy ship or airship. And the challenge is that they were experiencing something so frequently, and this would be referenced by someone very high stature and respected Admiral, Rear Admiral Tim Gallaudet, now retired, but also an oceanographer and scientist, and he actually led naval observatory as well. So he has the view of both worlds. And they had to stop training operations, which take a lot of planning and brings a lot of various forces and often countries together in order to coordinate the work and see how everybody responds. And it's not something small that you just pull out of. And so Tim Gallaudet receives an email which is only sent to very few of his colleagues, so top of the, I guess, admiralty, if you wish, who are privileged to receive on secret network and emails. And it says, if you know what this is, notify immediately. And there's a video and the description. And in the shortest period of time, it gets deleted. And then Tim is meeting his colleagues, and a meeting of similar, not, well, same colleagues, and they do not speak about this. And so Ryan's experience, so now we're talking about Rear Admiral, right? And someone that Ryan would take this to. And that's why it's beautiful, because Ryan is speaking for the team he's responsible, right, for safety on of his team that he's coordinating and teaching and training, and not only training but looking after safety. And Tim Gallaudet, who's looking also for safety from oceanography and weather perspective, but also deciding go or no go in terms of weather phenomena and how they operate. And so in this case, Ryan is experiencing with his colleagues on a daily flight. So several times a day they go out and they see a sphere, and inside they see a cube. And they talk about this among themselves because it's actually flying between them information. And I don't know if you've seen ever air shows, the formation is pretty tight, and to actually have something even closer to them in flight, it is very unusual, to say the least. So they're working with this, and one of the recollections that I have from Ryan's discussion is that they're playing this video on the display, and the admiral of the ship, whom they're bringing this up safety issue, comes down, and Ryan just shifts into the room, at the back of the room, just to see the reaction of the admiral. So the admiral looks at the video and walks out. So, and Ryan's take on this is that he's seen this, but he's not willing to talk about this. And yet, this is so pertinent that there's no way to report it. You go up and you don't know what it is. You don't have the orders or procedure or on how do you behave, because otherwise, well, it's a training space. It's not a military operation that you are in the active space. So now this is the context on how you then, as a professional, work with it. So they need to contain it. They can't say to Admiral, who is leading the ship and really are responsible for the safety and what happens on the ship. He's responsible for safety, and his guys are talking to him that, what do we do? So they have this experience. And eventually, Ryan leaves the Air Force to actually bring this topic to the public, similar to like Lou Elizondo, who was working on AT program. And he had to leave, his decision to leave the, in a sense, well-being of his family, because he's a father he's supporting. Same with Ryan. He has a young child. And being able to, know that historically, that Some people disappear literally in aviation. Either they get assigned very far, or you never hear from your friends that have got reassigned for some reason. And it's almost like appreciated or understood, or it's unspoken rule that if they don't speak to you, you don't reach out, because it's on need to know basis. So this is another rule that is embedded. So that if you are not asked, you don't talk, and you don't ask if you're not spoken to. Yes, can you see this aspect? Is that if you mention, it's ingrained with you through training, through ranks, that this is how you communicate, and it's a professional communication methods, and you know exactly what to say, when not to overstep the bounds, and when you can push the boundary, but you are cut off and you know not to go there. So this is what these people, women and men, are dealing with.
Interesting example of Ryan and Lou there, who, knowing that the taboo was so powerful, still they realized they couldn't just go to work every day and live with the fact that they knew that this was going on. It had changed them internally so radically that they knew they wouldn't be able to live themselves without taking it public. And I find that absolutely extraordinary. That level of courage, knowing what they're going to come up against, just all inspired by how life-changing those experiences are.
And so it's so profound for Ryan that he decides to make this choice. And he's literally changing his life. Yeah. Someone who could work possibly, for longer, get a very good future life past his service. And it's very demanding on the body. A lot of them have a lot of physical challenges as they leave because of the G's they pull, because of how harsh the landing is, how harsh is the stop, because they literally, when they land on the deck, they are captured on a string. So the forces that are not natural for our body to experience are continuously repeated. So when they work, there's a very limited short time space, and every year gives them an advantage to secure something that they could provide for the family. And if they're the sole providers, it's a big deal, that they have children who are going to grow up. And so all of these decisions are playing on what to say. So Ryan, in this case, make a profound change in his life because of what he's experienced. But not only he has the courage to speak out for his colleagues. So because there's a close knit that I personally have only seen in military, in aviation specifically. I have seen that in space among astronauts, and I also have seen this in expeditions, but not as much as in this military situations because of what they live through and then are able to share with other people.
Yeah, that was my next question, was about the astronauts. I'm guessing that the taboo is even worse for the astronauts because they're actually in outer space, so the psychological evaluations are even stricter, as we discussed before. I mean, I'm assuming that none of them have ever shared such phenomena experiences publicly. I confess I don't know. I've never actually looked it up. Are
Yeah.
there any public stories of astronauts, or maybe some that you've shared privately in your interviews that you can share online?
So with astronauts and pilots, the challenge is that they do have an evaluation, a yearly evaluation, and if they're flying for space missions, they get evaluated continuously. And of course, before flight, especially before they're assigned to flight, and they're then continuously, if you wish, on show. So they're being watched continuously, and you're not just because when you're assigned to flight, you're not the only one to fly. You have a backup crew and another backup crew, just in case something happens, and they train together. And if one of the crew is something is happening to them, could be something, could be a family issue, could be a mundane physical issue that just happened to be like that they can't go. the whole crew gets reassigned. So the stakes are so high. It's not just you, it's your entire crew, because they've trained together and they work together. They would reassign the whole crew to go up. They don't just reassign one person. And they train parallel should this happen. Of course, nobody wants this to happen. Equally, the backup crew wants it. They understand the stakes for the primary crew to go to space. So this is another pressure that they have. And the other challenge is that this might be their only chance to go to space if they're going for the first time. They may never go fly again, for some political reasons, right, and technology reasons. Anything could happen that they wouldn't go. So the stakes are very high, and astronauts spend about 5% of their entire career actually doing space work, in space. So that is also extraordinary. So yes, they do not say anything what could possibly compromise them, but they're not have to be careful just at the interview. They have to be careful throughout. And most of the time, they live in communities, like in the Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center. All the families actually grow up together. So they have children living there, their wives, and they, talk to each other together. They often travel together. They would go, let's say, to Houston to train to Houston. They will also be among that community. And so you have to be cautious all the time. So if you can imagine the military scenarios, or what happens, for example, in theater would not be discussed at home. So there is this compartmentalization, but yet it is on your mind. So not even with their close family and friends that they don't feel comfortable, or it could compromise that being watched through all of that, would be shared. So often they deal with this by themselves.
And
And
where
of
does this
course,
leave us with reporting? Yeah, because I know reporting of safety issues is part of your work.
yes.
Have these revelations, have stories like Ryan's and Lou's changed the way reporting is being done? I mean, I know that we're talking about the US military, but I imagine this is going to be happening across the militaries of the world. Have we seen any change to this taboo since these revelations
Yes.
have been normalized?
Yes. So if we come back to pilots, so Ryan Graves set up an organization as part of American Institute for Aeronautics and Astronautics. So it's AIAA. Before he established American for Safe Airspace, so ASA. And there's a group. It's called UAP Outreach Committee. And I subscribe to be a volunteer, part of the human factors team. And on that human factors team, there is a medical professional who also deals with safety and interested in the anomalies, if you wish, that happen in surgical environment. There is a human factors expert who is leading the group. There is a previously air crew who is also part of the team who had experienced the phenomena and was on History Channel, if you remember, Lou Elizondo and Chris Mullen's, when they established, just as the New York article came out, it was in COVID, and they had a series of unidentified anomalous phenomena on History Channel, where pilots who had experiences have come up and talked about this. And so he was part of that second season. And so what Ryan wanted to do is to collate experts, and this organization, AIAA, has over 30,000 aviation and airspace professionals. So these are engineers, these are astronauts, there are also pilots, anyone who management equally, you cannot fly without management. So there's anyone who works with aviation, from scientists to practitioners to management. And Ryan wanted to give credibility and voice, because his interest is to unite other people and to bring the experiences forward, because we know in science and also in safety, data makes the difference. Only in accident so unfortunately, some of the safety advances one accident at a time, and it could be several lives. So we don't have to, in aviation safety is a bit faster, I would say, than in science, to collect case studies, which for some reason are called anecdotes in other fields, but it is a case study which is vital to consider. So he's bringing together these experts, and part of the work or the effort we did is that we have published a paper at the conference in 2024 that's run by American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, saying that there should be a proper reporting system and how could this be put together. And it took us over a year and a half, if not 2 years, to publish a white paper because I had to go through all of the reviews and considerations and be accepted. And also so people can use it as a foundation, which advises how to set up and what voice, how to give a voice to pilots, air traffic control, to report on anomalous phenomena. And we establish two aspects. One is that why it is important, such as that it doesn't weigh on the pilot's mind as they're flying, because they should be paying attention to what they're doing and not thinking, what if this comes up? What if, what do I do about that? And I can't talk about it again. And I actually know a captain who have reported to a psychologist that he's seeing privately that they wish they don't ever see a UAP or UFO. And you don't want an operator of any kind not to see. So it's because the way our mind works is that, let's say, if you want to purchase a car, and I don't know, you have a particular brand, Toyota, Ford, I don't know, Volkswagen, BMW, you name it. And as you are thinking of buying that car, suddenly all the cars on the street, it's like everybody's driving it. And then once you purchase that car, you also notice this cars, but before it wasn't in your field of view. So you were not noting that. So same thing is that if we don't have it in our mind, if you don't look for it, you won't find it. But if it becomes a safety issue, such as that it's on your flight path and in 3D, when you're scanning the sky, which is different to us, bounded by the ground, majority of our life, we actually our eyes are not trained to look above or below on moving objects. So when you're first time flying, and these are my experiences of training and also then coming back to update my flying hours, when you're flying with a pilot, with a training pilot who is either checking you again, they notice things before you do, even though they're much more clearer in your sight, because let's say you're sitting on the left or on the right, and because they are trained to scan. So if you're not scanning, you will not see it. And if somebody doesn't want to see something, that's really bad. So that's first, is to give the credibility of why it is important that pilots cannot, no, they should be given the freedom to speak about what they see,
And has this been integrated into the Air Force yet, or in other countries? Do we see any change in actual military protocol?
So following the article by Leslie Keane and colleagues in New York Times, and I believe it was in the second year of COVID, the Navy issued. So Navy is kind of more advanced publicly in taking this forward. They issued a procedure on what the pilots should do. So they were the first in terms of integrating this in procedures. I'm not sure if they had more incidences, if you wish, or encounters that they saw, but they took the lead on that.
Is that bleeding into NASA and into space organization, the ESA as well, or we're seeing even more resistance from the space agencies?
So as far as from my perspective, and Ryan's established the UAP Outreach Group in this professional organization and airspace, American for Safe Airspace organization. There is no formal procedure yet. But in the age of disclosure, you also, that is just came out publicly, there is a part of Federal Aviation Authority high official speaks about that this exists, but the I would say extraordinary element of that, they exist but they don't report. Like, I worked in Peru with Peruvian air traffic control, and they have a particular space where they see the phenomena go in and out of the water, but yet there's no official way of reporting it. I understand that Peruvian government as well is one of the few governments that are leading the way in collaboration and making this, documenting and seeing what we can do about this. But as far as I'm aware, there is no formal way to report it into a government space, if you wish, where it would be tracked. So when we were investigating that, and we have captured this in the white paper, which is publicly available, you can just go to, we can put the link if you wish into our
Certainly.
description, that discusses of what is currently, what kind of options are available, and what we recommend based on talking to this organization, based on speaking with pilots, and understanding what would be also convenient, because often this is done on their own time. So it's not like a part of their operation, because it's, a bird strike or something like that, or FOD, which is called foreign object debris, like on the runway or in the airport, where you report. So there is still no, to my knowledge of today, such a place. They still directed externally. The databases that was actually found by someone who worked at NASA, but it's done privately because they were shocked as well. And because NASA division, which I collaborated with as well, have a specific aviation related division. It's not airspace for astronautics, but they do have an aviation component. And a lot of research is done at NASA on aviation as well.
And have any astronauts come forward since these pilots have started to come clean? Has anybody been brave enough to come forward publicly, or has anyone spoken to you privately?
So there is there is a public interview recorded by, just let me remember, one of the early astronauts.
Buzz Aldrin. Buzz Aldrin?
No. Okay, it will come to me. So they don't talk about these experiences still publicly. I do know that there are reports in Russian in but all of them talk about this when they retire and have no stakes.
Absolutely.
So in essence, the challenge that we have is that, apart from Edgar Mitchell, who spoke openly about it, the other astronauts, and I think the good reference, and I don't have a better reference than Diana Pasulka, someone in her book who worked for NASA and worked and interfaced directly with astronauts. They say they sign a non-disclosure agreement or something that they don't speak about. I haven't worked with that level of clearance. I just didn't need to. My respective work is working with pilots to support psychological support. And by definition, in aviation and also in, especially with astronauts, there is a division of psychologists who often don't even talk to each other. Do you remember that again? That there's a compartmentalization. If you don't ask, you don't speak. And although it's not military and it's civil, there is still an element that some things you don't push, and you sense that as a psychologist. So there is psychologists who are responsible for training. There is a psychologist who are responsible for evaluation, and there is a psychologist who are responsible for support during the mission. And there is also another fourth group of psychologists who are responsible for research. So my colleagues in Russia or in Moscow, there's an institute for biomedical problems which was found after the first flight of Yuri Gagarin. And so they do research and they interview every single cosmonaut who comes back. But those interviews are also limited, meaning that that goes on record and gets analyzed, and the cues are focused on safety and collecting experience. It's not about unusual things, and they would just not say it because
So
they
the
might
short
never
answer
grow up.
is so the
No.
short answer is astronauts have not reported this either publicly or privately.
Possibly when they meet and experience this together. What we do know, which is actually on record, and you can pull this up, and this is on NASA website. I believe it was Apollo 10 that I provided Diana when she was writing a book about that interview, and I think it's her book Encounters, that when they were behind on the other side of the moon, on the dark side, where they have a silence, radio silence with the ground, they heard a sound, all of them, which was not a radio signal, which was not something that was playing inside the craft, and they received this over radio, and it had structure to it, if you wish. And so as they were listening to this sounds, they were actually discussing, do we say or not say this to the ground? But that's beautiful that it's on record. So I'd imagine in this one instance, that which is beautiful because you have this evidence that do we say this or do we not say this? And also they're describing and don't know how to talk about this sound, and it's almost like you can read beyond the boundaries of why they decide or not decide to talk about this, how they talk about this among themselves because it's on record. And it gives you that perspective of the culture or context, what you're allowed and not allowed to say. And
So
yeah.
So yeah, I'd love to just chat briefly about Diana and Garry and other people you've met since these interviews. You've got to know a few of my previous guests. You mentioned Diana, the religious studies scholar who's written about this phenomena academically, both in American Cosmic and she interviewed you. There's a whole chapter in Encounters about Ia's work. And knowing that you were a scientist, she then recommended you to her friend, the biomedical scientist Garry Nolan at Stanford, director of the Soul Foundation, who has studied anomalous brain scans of experiences, and he's analyzed retrieved materials with his very high definition spectrometry inventions. Now, this Soul organization was set up by Garry Nolan with the support of Stanford Medical School for the scientific investigation of this very bizarre phenomena and these recovered materials. Now, I know you've spoken at several of the Soul conferences, including one very recently here in Italy. Just tell us how your particular scientific perspective is relevant to the UFO topic. And I'm also fascinated to know what you think needs more scientific investigation in this particular bizarre phenomenon.
So there is a very good interview that Ryan ran called the merge, because merge is actually an aviation term. That's I think it's a beautiful term where we talk about why I would like for pilot, to support the pilots and give them the foundation based on my background. And so the particular interest is that because I studied something I believe we already referred to very early on in our interview, speaking about the ghost in the cockpit. And so in my original, I guess, professional storyline, I have heard pilots refer to things that they couldn't explain, let's say in this metaphorical way, a ghost in the cockpit. Clearly there was not a ghost in the cockpit, but it felt like something was doing things that they were not aware of. And the ghost, if you wish, was made up by the way the aircraft were designed, or the philosophy was designed. And the mismatch was in the way we think. So the engineers think on how the flight is progressing and what the aircraft is doing and what the pilot needs to know about the health of the aircraft or where they're flying. But the pilot, when they're flying, they only need certain things about the health of the flight, and they're actually reinterpreting what is originally on the clock dials. But now we go into a glass cockpit, which is a computer screens, and we can put any information, like we could put swirls, we could, do all sorts of things. And now we restructure the information display, and some things get hidden or put in a different space. And like the flight data computer or the system where they program flight or the flight paths and equally the procedures and the beacons and all the information that used to be in the paperback now is embedded inside, and they can just pull it up. And the aircraft is doing something and the queuing disappears. So, for example, the aircraft is in particular mode, it's in autopilot and it's controlling a speed, right? They are how fast they're progressing through the air. Well, actually against the ground, because you're calculating the wind might be different, but how fast you're progressing on the course. So sometimes, you can get to a destination an hour faster, and it's because you had a favorable winds. And now the aircraft, when it exceeds, it's called flight envelope, which is a safe operation of the flight, and they need to alert the pilot, let's say, to do the next step or take over. And some modes would disengage. So, for example, the aircraft no longer controls the speed of the aircraft or one element of autopilot, because it could control navigation, it could control general, let's say, speed, vertical speed. There are combinations, which was very new to the new generation. And some of them would swap. In fact, some of them would be even named the same, which was, even more confusing. And the pilot would not know that the aircraft switch on how it is operating in flight. So it felt like somebody is operating, like there's a number and somebody else is operating. So and when I heard pilot talking about the UFO, I thought, well, this is exactly what we had before, where these pilots who did not know what was happening in the cockpit, they were actually not able to report this problem because they would either be said that you didn't get your training, because the pilots who were experiencing were captains who were training other pilots, and they had these problems. So it's because the training was designed that way, and the captain who trains, who's very senior and often responsible for safety, also having these experiences, and they don't understand what happens. They don't want to be lose their job, and they seem to manage the flight, and they try to reconstruct, and in the pub conversations they start noticing that it's not just one person, that it's a lot of them are having these instructions. So they're building forums because they cannot go back to the manufacturer and they say the aircraft is flawed because they don't understand. And the blaming culture at the time, as we mentioned again, also in our initial conversation, that there was 50% pilot error. It was considered that was a human error of the pilot that was causing an accident. Actually, it wasn't. It was embedded already in the design that it was impossible to detangle. And it was just this Swiss cheese model that we also discussed about James Reason, where all these errors align. And so I saw the parallel to say, like, look, they're talking about this hush hush until they get enough evidence to bring this forward. And I talked about this in conference about the ghost in a cockpit. And we, not just me, but a lot of human factors people, and a lot of us were very young in our career, and established human factors experts were pulling together this data and saying, look, people are discussing this in forums. This is a serious safety problem. So together, we brought this up to manufacturers, pointing out. And so we were distilling where the problems are before accidents have happened, and accidents have happened because of these problems as well. But we had a backup data of incidents that pilots reported it in forums. So I saw the similarity of what was happening 20 years ago. And I, reached out to Ryan and said, like, look, Ryan, we had this problem before. Let's tackle it in the same way. Let's not wait. Let's see how we can use that culture change of reporting, because then it became not a blame culture. So there was a culture shift change where there was not blaming anymore the pilots, but they had a reporting system where the errors and problems were reported as incidences that they could then be stacked up and start to looked at. So that's how I got into UAP, and feeling that we can build it up from safety point of view, just like Ryan entered in the same way. But I always support the pilots. I'm not leading. I'm just looking at their reports. So I thought we cannot discount the ghost in the cockpit or out of the cockpit.
And
If they're seeing something.
And given the academic research of people like Garry and Jacques Vallée, also Diana coming more from the humanities, you coming so deeply from within aeronautics itself and space research, what do you think needs to be done? What's left on the list of, well, I should say, let me rephrase that. What scientific investigation needs to be launched now from your unique point of view, given what Garry, Diana, and other colleagues are trying to take mainstream?
Well, I think the very important aspect of the same message that we were putting out before is that experiences are shared when they are not ridiculed. So this is so important. And because the onset of social media, which wasn't as strong during 25 years ago, we now I would like to bring forward the understanding, which I talked about at two conferences now, the latest Seoul in 2025, which hopefully will come up in the new year, available for public to view. And I think for members at Seoul, it will be sooner. You can listen to why I describe that preserving the story at its essence is the most precious data set that we could have in understanding the phenomena, on how it affects our perception, our consciousness, our values. And if we share it too soon, before we've integrated, or we share it with the wrong audience, we filter out what it's safe to say. And those specific things that are not safe to say, or they're not safe to say because they challenge the worldviews of usually this person that we're speaking, but also our worldviews that we don't feel comfortable sharing yet because we don't want to be put down, because it's so prescient, and often it's so internally elating. So they're not all negative. It's enlightening, or it's elating experience. And if we look at the very recent interview of Jake Barber in January 2025 on News Nation with about his helicopter experience, where he's retrieving craft. His experience, so he has an established military career, and he works in various forces, and then he goes into private hire, and here he's flying on a helicopter, and they don't know what they need to transport. They need to just to get to a place, take it, and often it's a very short flight because it's on the same, I guess, operating space, and he just needs to take one equipment to another space. And now he's flying. And as he's starting to approach the location where he needs to go, minutes apart, and it's not a long flight either, he's suddenly starting to get overwhelmed with feelings that he expresses like a love of a mother or a daughter, and he says it's like God, but it's more with the feminine space, and you could see his facial expression change, the voice tone change, the emotion, and he's trying to incorporate it into words of what his experience is. And he beautifully articulates the thought process, saying that, am I safe to fly? Because he's affected on emotional scale to such a degree that he doesn't feel it can be rational. That's what we're trained. So can you see that very thin line? If you're not rational, you shouldn't be flying, right? Which is quite interesting. If you are, emotional in some way, you can't be rational, which is not the case. The two can be interlaced beautifully. But for some reason, in order to be, a tough, top top gun operator, pilot, you have to be so cool that you can't be affected. And yet, all of them experience this in orbit due to, seeing how small we are, and William Shatner describing it, although a Star Trek captain. But astronauts have similar revelations. So this experience gives us this fragility of that phenomena that we don't tap in. We talk about metal. And yes, metal is important for all of the puzzle come together, or the structure or the mechanism or the physics. But we are losing the data point that is so crucial of how we are affected by it in other ways. And so Jake Barber brought this in a beautiful way to the public, that I've heard, from interviews with pilots on how they're affected by it, and they don't know what to do about it because they don't have a language to describe it. So they're looking for words and not. And so the key message that I would like to lead with, and I've worked, in presentation for Soul, is that we have to be precious about whom we talk about the experience first, and find the way to integrate it. And I talk about tools how to integrate that experience before, ground it in ourselves, feel what it means for us, find a safe place to share it, find the ways to explain it. And there's specific 5 factors that we can go into in order to articulate the story, not miss the elements which are vital for science, vital for humanities, and vital for the entire puzzle to come together, for all sciences together. And this is how we understood the ghosts in the cockpit. And, now we have safe aircraft, and we have a similar generational problem, the next generation problem, that we now need to address in similar rigor.
Well, that is a fantastic offering to the field, and I'm sure Garry and Sol are extremely, extremely happy to be able to bring this forward, and it'll be useful for Ryan Graves's organization as well, won't it? Now, moving on here, some of these phenomena that we've been talking about include telepathic interaction with entities, with non-human intelligences. And psi phenomena and their scientific inquiry is a topic that has fascinated you since the start of your career, following a lot, for example, the experiments and papers of my previous guest, Dean Radin, who we've already mentioned, the head scientist at IONS. That organization, listeners, that was founded by the astronaut Edgar Mitchell after his Samadhi experience. So by means of sort of setting the scene for your new book on nonverbal communication for toddlers and your new book on parent-child relations having such sort of deep potential for spiritual transformation, I want to mention your research into a very particular type of psi phenomena that I hadn't heard of, found in these children called spellers, children that are on the autistic spectrum that have always been nonverbal, so were never understood as any more than just mentally challenged. While in fact, it's now been realized that these children are not only able to communicate telepathically, often with their parents. But even to learn telepathically by, I don't know, reading minds is the phrase we would use. Of course, doesn't sound very scientific, does it? But please tell us here this extraordinary story of this group of children and what it teaches us about nonverbal communication, which we went into in the first part of the interview.
Yes. So Diane Hennessy Powell is a scientist, a psychiatrist who looked into gifted autistic children, where they have. She started her research in understanding why these children, have extraordinary ability to speak several languages, and yet they're unable to operate, to look after themselves, and savants. So they're called savants. And she eventually started to receive reports of children who and parents that they have a telepathic connection, meaning that the child is able to tell what the parent is thinking, or they would have, for example, something like, well, you are. Of course, I know about this because you watch the television, but the child was nowhere near that television. So they could start a conversation with the child, watching the television. But what was even more challenging is that the child did not speak as you and I are conversing. They learned to, and this also took a while, and the method is also very recent, that they learn children to point at letters initially. So initially it was like a board with few letters on, and these children don't have an ability to coordinate their body. So how these children describe their inexperience now that they can communicate in pointing to the letters. So they communicate one letter at a time. It's very intensive and takes a lot of effort. So they explain the reason they're flailing about, for example, that behavior that looks very odd to someone, and the children are being medicated, not flailing because they might be hitting something and damaging their own body. But they're actually trying to feel their body. They're trying to embody their physical body. And what is interesting, so they are saying that they so this is a new term that been not new, but a beautiful phrase that been coined by Kai Dickens, who popularized this topic on Spotify, and called telepathy tapes. And they've just finished a film that will come out in January or early next year about these children. She says, and she's a producer and award-winning documentary filmmaker, and they're working with Diane Hennessy Powell and these children and families on illustrate and record from all points of view to run the experiments that would be scientifically valid. And they're showing this in a setup in the documentary film. But first they've done the documentary audio. And the key line that she beautifully put, Kai Dickens, is called assume competence. And I think this is such two beautifully put words together, because like to the pilot or like to the astronauts, if you assume competence of that person in all of their capacity as you're listening to the experience and put aside all our doubts as we're listening, and put all our contextual, frameworks that we operate under. And what happened is that when you walk into the room with these children who are able to communicate telepathically, if you assume competence, they actually want to speak with you, want the way to communicate with you, not verbally, but through the board. And that assumed competency happens when they are with teachers in their schools that they go to be able to look after themselves. But a lot of these non-speakers, or rather spellers, are not allowed to go to mainstream schools because they're considered that they are not getting anything, because there's no output to check of what they're doing. But actually, they are well ahead of the entire class. and they want to be in the class because they're reading teacher's mind. And because these children the teachers are often more open because they see more children of the same or similar. They all have different grades of that, how they connect with their body, how they articulate, and how they're able to communicate. But the teachers are more willing to assume competency. And so teachers have often, before parents, experienced the telepathy with the child. But when they bring this up to colleagues or to the head of the school, some of them would, actually also be, lose profession and competency. And even the speech association, so language speech professionals, speech therapists, professionals, they banned the way for children to use the spelling board because they were saying that the parent or whoever the assistant holding the child up, allowing them to point in a particular location, that they're moving the board. But the child unable to feel their body unless they are touched, because then that sensation allows them to enter their body and coordinate better. So they do not know that they have hands. They actually say that. But once the hand is touched, they're able to feel it and then they're able to coordinate it. It takes a lot of effort. So these children, as it happens, once they start to communicate, they talk among themselves without even meeting ever each other. And they say that they go to a place they refer to as the hill, or a place where one of the mothers were explaining that after her child will come back from school, he would run up to his bedroom and run on the bed and cover himself with pillows, with with blankets, and just stay there. Or another child would pace from one side of the room at a particular time of the day, all day, all that time, they will be just pacing. And what was happening in both of those cases, they wanted to connect with other kids telepathically because they go almost into this rooms or spaces where they meet similar children with similar abilities, and they spend time communicating. It's like their Zoom call, if you wish, and they would be communicating, and also they will be learning languages that their family does not speak, and they're often so dissimilar, like let's say Mandarin and English and Portuguese. Some ancient languages, some children are able to interpret ancient languages. Some children learn about history, some children learn about ability. One of the girls wants to become a geneticist, and she probably has a lot to offer. But how do we allow her to learn and then to articulate back, her perception, because they almost have like a library that is in the ether, and they can access even previous thinkers' knowledge.
I understand they're also interacting with on the hill with entities as well. These teacher figures who aren't human intelligences.
Yes, so I don't study myself, I don't work with these children. I'm just interpreting what I have. I had a brief conversation with Kai, but Diane Hennessy Powell is the expert, and Kai Deacons, and also the teachers. There is a book. It's called The Book of Heaven, that's written by a mother who has 5 children, and one of her children has is a speller, and her tribulations on how she was told that there's nobody in there. And then she discovers that the child is telepathic, all of that journey, raising children on her own. And then understanding that this child is, getting knowledge from entities, as you say, or I don't know how to describe it, a library, that they are given an opportunity to pick out a particular path. So they almost like go to a parallel school where, and I do not know enough to say how they're given the topic, that they pursue, because they all have their own interests and they all have their experience. And one of the children who suddenly actually passed away was leading and supporting and teaching other children and supporting them up there who could not get support through their parents because their parents were not aware that these children are able to communicate. So often these children ask parents, can you find this child? But they wouldn't be able to describe the location because they also have telepathic ability, and they're trying to reach the parents to tell the parents.
How does this relate, to what we spoke about professional intuition?
Yes.
Is this the same mechanism, or is your intuition that there may be a connection between the way you found expertise being transferred so intuitively earlier in the conversation, or is it just impossible to know if these two phenomena are connected?
I personally, currently, I don't see the connection in terms of how I studied it, because so there is definitely deep knowing that is preverbal, and the person often doesn't know that they know this more than another expert, and and how they make that decision can be justified backwards, let's say for a medical committee, and there would probably be a good justification historically of why they eventually made that choice and decision. But at the time, they don't go through that. At the time, they just know that they're the right things to do, and that's how we advance, medical science and science. Is that there's this intuitions that the person think about, and they suddenly. And what is another interesting aspect, talking about telepathy and entities, and yeah, that innovation happen across the world at the same time, often in different cultures, different languages, no way of communicating, but they spur up at the same time. So that's interesting on how come that unrelated cultures would start to advance. Some of them are very scientific advancement at the same time, and it's almost like the revelation is given somewhere, through navigating these puzzles. But I think the inquiry also happened within us. So if we don't have an aptitude or questions that rise in our mind, we don't have the answer.
So
So
how does
that,
this fit with your work on nonverbal communication? Because that led to a book that you wrote shortly after having your first child
yeah,
about the idea of presenting images to children
yeah,
as young as non-speaking toddlers in such a
yeah.
way as to think, well, listen, maybe we can communicate with them just because they're nonverbal makes no difference. Tell us a little bit about that first book before we talk about your new one.
Yes. So what happens is that, for one, there is this very known phenomena called imprint, where the duckling, when it comes to the world and sees the cat and thinks it's the mother, we have children who have been raised by animals as well, and some of them are very devastating stories. But it maps on how we navigate the world. And we came like packaged, like if you wish, we have the capacity to develop to any language, to any culture, physical abilities. This is what science knows. And yet, if we were not exposed to a particular accent, to particular tonality, there's a whistling language, that if should we be born with it, we would be able to discern. But if we are not, and the tonal languages like the Chinese languages, they allow for us to pick it up and also pronounce. So if we don't pronounce, we don't hear it. So there's this interesting link. And hence, if we don't have musical ear, it doesn't mean that we will not develop it. We just didn't have enough listening so that we could then replicate the sound. And that happens not only audibly, but it also happens perceptually, which is interesting. And this was discovered by a professor in Canada who came from China at age of early 20s. And he was in the underground or in the public transport. And he looked at the local population, and they all looked the same. And, like if you grow up, I mean, I grew up in Latvia, everybody's different, right? Like you go to Canada, probably everybody's different too, But if I first time was exposed to Indian culture, we had a whole flight arriving in Latvia, and I was the one who was checking the passports of, I was very young. It was the first, it's actually how the Baltic Airways was formed, Baltic Airways, and the two founders were two people from India. And so what they were doing, they had a flight from India that was not operated by Baltic Airways, but it would come to Latvia from India, and then they would fly to two German countries, Düsseldorf and Frankfurt. And so we were doing everything from issuing tickets to, being pre-flight, not the cabin crew, and doing passport checking because, this is like 80s, 90s. And so I was looking at the passport, and I was looking at the people who were in the line. They dressed the same. They look the same. They have same facial hair, and I couldn't tell them apart. I couldn't tell apart the photograph and the person. And then I lived in Dubai for 4 years, and I absolutely could tell apart from which part of India individuals came from. But when we exposed first, so what this Canadian professor from China was referring to is that he was surprised to how come he couldn't discern the features. Clearly he knew they were different, but perceptually he couldn't. So he studied newborn children to see when this differentiation happens. And apparently between months 6 to 9, we learn to differentiate the features of the face. So if we look at the family of, let's say, monkeys, there is a Peter, there is, Colin, there is Anna, there is, Georgina, and we can tell. But as soon as past 9 months, they're just a monkey family. The child cannot tell the individuals within that community. And so something maps, and we stop paying attention to particular features. And what was my interest? My interest was is that we were showing. My devastation was when I bought the first black and white book for our children, that it had absolutely mindless to me, mind-numbing pictures. And I thought, there's no way the child is looking at my face and they're fascinated, and it's got so much complexity that they would be interested in this checkered board, or a mouse that doesn't even look like a mouse, made of shapes. And so I thought, let's see, like I design a cockpit, what kind of perceptual cues they're interested, which is what I learned from pilots, but also what physiology they have that permits them affords them. So it's called affordance in cognitive engineering, what they afford to take in, what they're able to and what they pay attention to. And there was actually quite a lot of research. It's amazing that you could study, a nonverbal, right? A person who gives very little cues. And so I distilled those principles and I actually found, and then based on those principles, I started to look up pictures that I could show them. But what I wanted to show them, the real world, what the world is made of. And I went to nature, of course, and also the most beautiful human designs, both from engineering, architecture. And what I found is that they all look like mandalas, like I have here. So this is brittle skeleton of a starfish. So at every part they will have, the arms, right? But all of this actually matches our facial laws of proportions. So like Fibonacci sequence, the golden section, they're all connected. And it's all embedded in every part of nature you look. And when we study this, either in biology or in architecture or engineering, when we learn to draw proportions, and the most successful art, architecture, engineering, even Large Hadron Collider, which is underground under several countries where we do the most advanced experiments to understanding the foundation of the universe.
And it's
It's
in this
actually,
toddler's book, listeners. It's in
yes,
this
it is. It's in
toddler's
the
book.
book. Yeah, yeah. I
The
don't think
Large
it
Hadron
appears.
Collider's in there.
Yeah, yeah. So this is an architectural design also following those laws. But the reason we're drawn to do that because there is a mystery there, because there's a pattern that is persistent throughout. And as people who are trained to be observers of the art or the detail, and those talented experts, why they become successful, because they look for that pattern to replicate it intuitively. And so I want the children not to study this at the university, yeah, but to have that imprint, not just through our face or the faces that they exposed, but through other patterns that are available around us.
So, yeah, I must move us on to our last question because it would be appalling not to talk about your brand new book, because we've got to go and pick up our kids.
Yes.
Your most recent book, so hot off the press, I think you haven't even released it yet.
Yes.
Listeners, of course, if you're listening to this after it comes out, it'll be in the show notes. Tell us briefly, Ia, before we go, how does this idea of a universal language that somehow transcends verbal language tie in with your new book about the parent-child connection?
Yes. So the way it began is because I started to, first I did it just for my children. And then friends said, why don't you publish this? This is so fascinating. So the book became published for the newborn babies. And then they said, well, what is this about? Can you tell us about why is it important? And so I did the course for children, which still exists. And I teach about why these pictures actually teaching the nonverbal communication. So it's cueing us parents to the newborn baby and pick up how we communicate, to attune. And it's more about the experiential communication rather than what we used to, the verbal. And these parents, they tune in and they tell me things that they know about, what the child, doing or feeling or thinking. They feel they're very much in tune. And then these parents said, well, but I want to keep going with your ear. Can you tell me what to do next? And so that's when the next course was born. And based on this discussion with these parents, now the book is written about how the children awake us to actually remembering to how we were children and what we knew before the concepts of social constructs have abstracted, or if you wish, narrow our perception field or narrow our neural connections. We have the capacity through neural regeneration, we can actually awaken our capacities. It just takes a little bit longer for an adult, but we can, such as with telepathy and also sight without eyes, which I have also worked on that as a child as well. I was interested in that. And so that book allows to turn to teachers, to children as teachers, but not meaning that they know what to do. We are here to help them navigate the world, but we are also here to listen. And what, yeah.
Do we have a title yet? Yeah.
Yes.
Have you decided? Is it with the publishers? How long do we have to wait?
I would say within a month it would be published. So hopefully before Christmas.
Well, certainly before this comes out. So it'll be in the
Yes.
show notes. Do we have a title?
Yes. Born Knowing.
Born Knowing. That's a beautiful title.
Yes.
So, listeners, thank you so much for bearing with us right to the end here. What an extraordinary career and what a massive information Ia has given to us today. Please go off if you're interested in the space psychology side and get the toolkit for a space psychologist book. And what was it?
Knowing.
Born Knowing will also be in the show notes. Please support Ia's work. And Ia, it just leaves me to thank you so much for giving us so much time, so much detail, your openness, your extraordinary professionality, and your thoughts for these pilots and astronauts. Ladies and gentlemen, Ia Whiteley, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Much appreciate the audience and the questions and your time and your beautiful listening skills.
I wouldn't be much good at my job if I couldn't listen, would I? Yeah.